Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Joseph Hammer, and I received an email from a counseling psych doc student who had some really good questions and was curious for my feedback on it based on my personal experience. So I thought I would record a video and share some of these thoughts so that everybody could benefit from hearing my own personal experience. And I hope that this sort of feedback could be helpful for you if you find yourself in a similar situation. So the first question was, how have your research interests shifted over time? And it's a really interesting question. When I was an undergraduate, by my sophomore year, I knew that I liked both psychology and philosophy and religious studies and some other pieces. And it was through getting involved in the Counseling Center paraprofessional program at the University of Illinois and getting exposure to therapy-esque sorts of experiences and just learning more about psychology through my classes that I ended up leaning towards psychology as what I wanted to primarily study and major in, with philosophy and religious studies as minors. And when I got to the point where I said, okay, I think I want to go to graduate school to get a degree, maybe so I can practice as a psychologist, and I determined that a PhD might be a good fit for me for many reasons, then I learned that, okay, so I have to figure out a research area or areas that is interesting to me, because for most of these counseling psych doc programs, it's a mentorship model where you go to work under a professor who has a given research interest. And so you have to be able to sell yourself as being interested in the same sort of topics as the professor. Otherwise, they'll fear that you might not be a good fit. And again, not all programs are like that. Places like University of Iowa, for example, have more of a group mentoring model where people don't have to pick a specific advisor and a specific topic right from the start. So there's some variation. So what I initially did to figure out what sort of research interests would be most interesting to me is this is a reflection of my personality, definitely. I got the list of all the sections of the American Psychological Association, or all the divisions, sorry, and looked through the entire list and crossed out those ones that weren't interesting and looked at what was left. So things like Division 17, Counseling Psych, Clinical Psych, 51, Psychology of Men and Masculinity, 36, Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, Division 19, Military Psychology, other pieces like that. I just took notice of what sorts of areas of research, and I went on these divisions' websites and learned more about the type of research that they do. And I also looked through the list of APA journals as well, and they're every time you're looking to submit stuff for the American Psychological Association's annual convention, or you're looking through what sort of programming is available at the convention, it has a really nice list of index topics where it's basically, because they want to categorize all conferences and presentations and symposia that occur at the convention by topic. So they have this really complete index list of topics, like 3.2, social psychology, 5.6, community psychology, stuff like that. So I looked through that list too, and basically I came up with a brainstorm list of those topical areas that seemed the most interesting to me. And after learning more about each of these areas, I finally narrowed it down to seeing the psychology of men and masculinity as what was most interesting to me at the time, because it was so interesting to me that people were studying how men's interaction with these gendered expectations of what a man is supposed to be in the United States, that people were studying this in a scientific, systematic way, because these had always been systems and influences and pressures that I had experienced as a boy and then a man growing up, and it was just so cool that they actually systematically study this. So that's where my research interest, that was my first official research interest in a way. That was really my own. I had worked also in the lab of Dr. Lisa Spannerman and got really interested in white racial identity development and social justice orientation among white students And so that was also by working in her lab something I was exposed to and seriously considered as a focus area for me. But men and masculinity ended up being the most interesting. So when I applied to mostly counseling psych doctoral programs, and there was one clinical psych doc program, I looked for professors who were doing work in that area. And over time, I started off at the University of Missouri as a master's student, working under Glenn Good, who did metamasculinity stuff. And during that time, my research interests started to shift. So I started squarely in the metamasculinity camp, and then I dabbled a little bit in positive psychology and kind of melded masculinity and positive psychology a little bit. And I noticed that with the masculinity literature, a lot of it was oriented around the topic of help seeking, which is studying what stops or helps people from getting help from a mental health professional when they need it, help seeking. And so I ended up doing a lot of masculinity / help seeking research that combined the two. And that's what eventually led me to Iowa State University to work under Dr. David Vogel in the psych department there, who did a good dash of masculinity stuff and a lot of help seeking, and especially stigma, self-stigma aspects of help seeking. So self-stigma is, I would feel bad about myself if I was to seek help from a psychologist. So my interest kind of shifted from mostly masculinity to a little positive psych and masculinity, into more of masculinity with some help seeking stuff. And over time, I'm more migrated squarely into help seeking, so that's kind of become my main focus. However, starting in my master's, I've also had kind of a pet research interest area as well, which is the psychology of atheism and non-religion. So I started back in 2008 in the middle of my master's program. I began working with some scholars who looked at non-belief and non-religion and psychological and sociological aspects of that, including discrimination and identity development and research methods that were culturally sensitive when it came to non-religious people. So that meant I was also interested in the psych of religion and spirituality to some degree, which was foreshadowed earlier in my career, and the fact that I liked philosophy and religious studies. It makes sense that the psychology of atheism would become an interesting area to me. So that's been my pet interest area throughout my career since 2008, though currently help seeking is kind of my biggest chunk. It's how I pay the bills, so to speak. And really starting later in my doc career, I developed another focus area, which is psychometrics, meaning how do we measure fuzzy abstract concepts like self-esteem or attitudes or stigma or spirituality? How do we measure these things well, especially when using things like self-report instruments, which have many advantages and disadvantages? So I started to develop this interest in measurement and psychometrics, factor analysis, scale development, survey research, things like that, which is more of a methodological or processy sort of focus area, which influenced my help-seeking research and my psychology of atheism stuff and some of my metamasculinity stuff. So currently, that's how my research interests have shifted over time, and so it's this melding of, I still dabble in some masculinity stuff, I do a lot of help-seeking stuff, a good dose of measurement and psychometric things that fit into those pieces, and some psychology of non-religion stuff. And so that's, up until this point, how my research interests have evolved. In terms of what's on the horizon, there's a lot of energy around integrated care right now. And so the Hammer Lab has started to do some work around integrated care and its intersection with help-seeking attitudes, and how do patients feel about it? Does it get their needs met? Do they feel less stigma if they think about seeing a mental health professional in an integrated care context? That hasn't really been studied so much. And that's the direction of healthcare in our country. It's going towards integrated care, in theory. So I can see my research interests probably ballooning into that as well. So that's how my interests have evolved over time. And again, I will tell those of you earlier in the process that in terms of some tips, do try earlier on in your career and continuously throughout, always try and check in with yourself about what feels most interesting, important, and passionate to you. Because grad school, and if you go into academia, the tenure track is strenuous. It's stressful, as many of you know who are on the path already. And you really gotta like what you're doing. You really gotta like what you're studying if you want to maintain a resilience and you want to maintain an energy and momentum going forward. Otherwise, it's really easy to burn out. Because I remember as an undergrad RA working on some things, or occasionally as a grad student working on a few projects for various reasons that were other people's work that just was not interesting to me, and it was tough, man. I had to drag myself out of bed, so to speak, to do that stuff. And so really do try and figure out where your niche is, what feels important to you, what sort of contribution to the well-being of people across the world can you make, right? Because you're going to make your best contribution when you're working on something that you're the most passionate about. You'll do your best work. And they say research is me search. If you've ever heard that phrase, totally true. I mean, I think about my research interests, and they definitely reflect things that have been personally important in my life or my family's life or whatnot. So it's definitely a reflection of my own personal interests, and that's fine. And certainly you want to be reflexive in thinking about how the biases you bring as a researcher influence the way you approach data, ask research questions, interpret the data. So I'm for certain that the biases I hold certainly reflect itself in how I do my work. But hopefully we're reflexive to the point where we're maintaining a good level of objectivity so that we're doing good, high-quality, ethical research throughout. But generally, it's generally advantageous to do things that feel personally important to you, because that's what's going to keep giving you the energy and the fuel to succeed. So, great question. Probably a longer answer than you might expect. And number 2, many doctoral students are strongly interested in, yet also intimidated by conducting their own research projects. Totally. What advice would you offer to students who find themselves frustrated with the research process? Tough question. All right. Yes. So, intimidated by conducting their own research. Absolutely. That is, I think, for most anyone, when you're starting to learn a new complex skill, like the research process, which has so many different components along the way, there's going to be ambiguity, frustration, and ineptitude, and a lack of self-efficacy. That's where we all start for any new skill, of course. So, why are we intimidated? It's because we don't know what to do. We're not familiar with these pieces. We're still working on these skills. It still feels like we're fumbling through some pieces. So, like, how do I review the literature in an efficient way that I don't get drowned in all these articles? How do I, after reviewing the literature, start to percolate ideas about what niche I want to fill with my project? How do I go from that idea into concretely operationalizing it in such a way that you can test it in a statistical fashion or through a qualitative analysis methodology? And then how do I actually administer the survey if it's survey research, or conduct the experiment in the context of a lab? How do I analyze it, clean the data, analyze the data, interpret it in a sensible way, check for assumptions on those analyses I'm going to run? How do I structure a manuscript? How do I create a funnel argument so it goes from broad to narrow down to my research questions or hypotheses in the intro? These are all, it's such a wide range of skills, and it's a lot. It's overwhelming at first. And so the way that I was able to sit with and work through that intimidation is by doing tasks that were at my appropriate developmental level. So ideally, We start as undergrads. We work as research assistants in people's labs, right? So we get experience with the basic potato skills, really basic stuff. And ideally, by the end of our undergraduate or start of our master's, we're moving into doing some more independent-y projects or pieces. Like, sure, I'll take on the lit review. I've learned how to use psych info and Google Scholar. You want to know about this thing called mental health literacy. Sure, I'll go do a lit review on that and kind of summarize in bullet point form what I found. That's a basic skill that every researcher needs to have. And at some point after a few semesters or years of undergrad RA sorts of stuff, you can then step up into that next thing because you've gotten enough familiarity with psych info and Google Scholar and writing a few APA style research papers that you can then step into that next more advanced thing. So ideally, you're always incrementally building on the complexity, on the autonomy of the things you take on. And so for some people, they didn't have a lot of opportunities for whatever reason to get those solid undergraduate experiences. And so those things really start to happen only in their master's program or maybe the first years of their doc program. Though it's generally hard to get into a doc program without having some solid, at least a few RA experiences, if not a senior thesis or something like that. So basically, if you're feeling intimidated, I would encourage a self-check where you say, okay, what are all the skills across the whole spectrum or the whole cycle of the research process? Those ones I articulated a few minutes ago. And what do I need to shore up? What feels weak? Or what is the next kind of skill that I need to bump up to push myself on and learn? Or what is something I feel like I'm supposed to know now, but I'm a little weak, and how can I strengthen that? And so usually, if you can identify that, you can speak with the professors in your program or department or in your professional network, and you try and figure out a way in which you say, I'm wanting to work on this skill. Can you use me? And can I perform this skill and practice this skill maybe under your guidance or under the guidance of an advanced doc student or advanced master student or something at your program? And sometimes professors with their projects or their doc students' projects or whatever can see a place for where you can contribute that piece, and you can get some mentoring and guidance around doing that piece. So you figure out where your kind of edge of competence is and work at that and build on that. So where we get into trouble, I think, is where we're assumed to have this, but we're trying to jump ahead to this because we feel that pressure, or it feels like people expect us to be at that level, which sometimes we're just not. You cannot skip stuff. You can't go from doing from downloading and finding some articles for people to doing a nice fat lit review. That's too much. You skipped some stuff in the middle in terms of annotated bibliographies and summaries of studies and some simple bullet pointing of important pieces from articles. So you have to build. Skipping it's going to create a bad time usually. So think about where you're at in your developmental trajectory. Identify the things you need to work on. Talk with your mentors, or identify and talk with mentors to help figure out what exactly are your edges of competence across the research cycle, and then say, okay, I need to work on these pieces. Where can I do that? Can I find somebody who's willing to allow me to work on that in the context of their projects or their research? Because you have to get enough of these foundational skills across the board before you're ready to conduct your own research, certainly in a pretty autonomous fashion. And so ideally, you can build up these foundational skills to the point where you're ready at some point. And for some people, it's their first year of master's or doc, and some people it's later in their graduate program. But where you're at a point where you can take the lead. You still, of course, need consultation and assistance from your advisor or research mentor or older team members or whatever it is, but you want to get to that point where you're taking the lead, but you know where your weaknesses are, where your growth edges are, and you can bring in people in your program or in your professional network to help you or guide you in those pieces. So, for example, at some point in my master's program, I knew what topic I wanted to study and what instruments might be a good fit, but I needed to double check that these instruments would fit the bill, were appropriate, really reliable and valid. I'm still getting a sense of what that meant and how to critique instruments. So that's where I had to bring in, say, a professor or an older grad student, say, okay, this is what I know, but I'm not quite sure about these pieces. Would you sit down with me for 30 minutes and vet what I'm thinking and help me think through these things? And they were able to do that. Likewise, when it came to, okay, I know I want to compare these groups on this dependent variable, and I think I'm going to use an ANOVA in this way, but I'm not quite sure. Then you reach out to someone with specific questions who has that expertise, and they can guide you and say, oh, well, here you're going to want to do repeated measures ANOVA, and here's a source that you can read on how to conduct that in SPSS and how to interpret it, you know? So it feels overwhelming when it's like, I need to do this big thing, but like anything, like SMART goals, if you've ever heard of that, you break it down into small manageable bits, identify the pieces you need help with. The more specific you can be in terms of reaching out to people and saying, I need help with X and Y, the easier it is for them to give it to you. When you come to them with a very general, like, I need to do a project, can you help me? As a professor, when I hear that, I'm like, that sounds really open-ended and ambiguous, and I have a lot of constraints on my time. And so if you can let me know more specifically what you need from me and how much of a chunk of time, I'm in a better position to know whether I can commit to giving you that or not. Because when it's open-ended and ambiguous, that can spell trouble and difficulty. Because we're beholden not only to our own program of research, but to helping our other students and reading over their work and helping them with that. So our time is beholden to a lot of people. So the more concrete you can be in terms of asking for specifically what you need from people, the more it will help people say yes to you. And the more systematic you've been about identifying the pieces you need, then the more they can see, okay, they're being responsible and systematic in identifying these pieces, and they have a vision for how to move forward and how to grow their skills. I think professors and mentors are more likely and feel more safe in helping you because it's not a potential open-ended mess that they might get mixed into. Yeah, so basically, ideally, you're always doing things in the research process that are at your developmental level. So you need to figure out what that is and work on the skills at the edge of your competence to always bring that developmental level up and to become more advanced. And over time, you shift from being fifth author, so to speak, on things and helping with little pieces to taking on bigger and bigger and more complex chunks of the research process of other people's studies. And at some point, you start moving from, okay, I've been second and third author a few times, and now I'm starting to be first author because I'm doing 51% or more of this project. I'm really the one pushing the lead instead of the first author or professor telling me, okay, do X, Y, and Z, student. It is, okay, I'm moving forward. Here's these pieces that I don't quite yet know how to do on my own. So person A, mentor A, professor B, can you help me with these pieces? So you're running the show, you're keeping it organized, and you're pulling in consultation as needed. You know, we make that transition eventually, and that's the path towards an autonomous researcher. So yeah, I hope that helps somewhat with that. So yeah, intimidation, I would think, is generally a product of, you know, the fact that we don't have as well developed skills in certain areas. There can also be, of course, imposter syndrome and other sorts of psychological forces at work, depending on how you have been socialized by your environment, your community, your family, your parents, your guardians, whatever it is, and your educational experiences and personal experiences. You've probably absorbed over time some messages about your own competence. Are you a generally competent person? Do you have a general sense of self-efficacy, especially when it comes to the academic realm? Do you really worry about failing all the time? You know, what are those core beliefs from a CBT perspective? What are those core beliefs that you walk around with that may create difficulties for you, that from which may flow automatic thoughts in triggering situations where it's like, there's this thing I'm not quite sure I know how to do. I'm bound to fail. It's not going to work. I shut down. I paralyze. I go back. I procrastinate. I go binge watch Netflix. You know, it's good to know what the core beliefs are that you have, that you walk around with, and the automatic thoughts and intermediate beliefs that flow from that. And if this is something that's standing in the way, these psychological pieces are standing in the way and really producing a lot of that felt intimidation for you, then, just like you've heard from every other professor, I found that personal counseling was really important for me to have at different points in my life to help me develop into the person that can do good work and be a good human being and a good partner and friend. So I encourage you to get whatever sources of help and guidance that would help break through those psychological barriers that can sometimes produce that intimidation. So again, for those of you watching this video, what is or is not a barrier or a creator of that intimidation for you will vary. And if you can identify what those things are, that's a really important step, because then you can work on those pieces. So yeah, that's the intimidation part. And then what advice would you offer to students who find themselves frustrated with the research process? So I've addressed, a lot of this is addressed that. And I guess I'm trying to think of other things I might add in. When it comes to frustration with ourself in the process, I think it's healthy to remind ourselves that this is a complex beast. Research is hard, right? And there are different levels of simplicity and complexity of research, but it's a tough enterprise. It is this multifaceted, multi-component skill that professors who are in the twilight of their career in their 60s and 70s are still having to learn and refine their understandings of things, and the statistics and the models and the research it's always moving forward. There's always new stuff. It's always evolving, so you can always fall behind if you don't keep up with it. So research itself has frustration built in to it. It's a part of the process. Like most worthwhile, important endeavors in life, conducting meaningful research is difficult and filled with frustrations, and that is okay. That's the nature of the beast, like anything meaningful. And so our ability to mindfully sit with that frustration and be self-compassionate and be empathetic with ourselves, and of course you feel really frustrated, it's tough in these ways and it feels out of your depth, and of course we're always feeling this imposter syndrome. That's normal. Even if my colleagues don't show it on the outside, when I talk with them one-on-one, they tell me they're feeling similar things, So this is a natural human reaction to the complexity of conducting research. So that's very normal, and the more you can be kind with yourself around that, I think is good. That can help you sit with the frustration while you learn and grow and hopefully lessen that over time. So I think those are my initial reactions to those two questions. So I hope this context is helpful, and certainly I'm willing to speak more in depth about pieces of these that I didn't address, and always encourage questions from students. I'm happy to record videos like these and post them just so that folks can learn if this is not information you've been exposed to by mentors or other people. I want to make psychology and getting into graduate school and this process of succeeding post-graduation, I want to make this as accessible to folks as possible. And some people don't have the luxury and the privilege of being exposed to mentors and situations and social capital where they get some of this guidance and feedback. And so I hope that by making this available to anyone who wants to watch it, that can help facilitate that for folks who maybe have less privilege and advantages and opportunities than I did as a white upper middle class male. So yeah, thanks.